we now have this IStockPriceService interface, and we have an implementation of this interface using the Financial Modeling Prep API. So now we can get stock prices, and what does that mean? Well, we can now create a service so that users of our application can buy and sell stocks. Now let's take a look at our UML diagrams for our domain services. So the next two services that we are going to implement in our application are the IBuyStockService and the ISellStockService. So let's go back to our application here, and we're going to go into our domain layer, and we have our services folder. Let's actually create a new folder, and we're going to name this Transaction Services. And inside of here is where we're going to have our IBuyStockService and our ISellStockService. So let's start off by doing the BuyStockService. Let's create that interface, and let's make it public, and it's just going to have one method, this buy stock over here. So let's create that. It's going to be a task, so we can make it asynchronous, and let's look at our little reference here. It's going to return an account, and the method is just going to be called buy stock, and it's going to take in an account, which is going to be the person who is buying the stock. It's going to take in the symbol for the stock that is being bought, and it's going to take in the amount of shares of the stock that is being bought. So let's go ahead and import all of this, and we should be good to implement this. One thing I should note is that we are returning an account, and the reason we're returning an account is the account that gets returned is going to be the new state of the user's account. So it's going to have the new transaction attached to it, and it's going to have the new balance of the user's account. So now that we have our interface defined, let's go ahead and create an implementation of the IBuyStockService. And we're actually going to do this right in our domain layer. So let's create a new class, and let's call it the BuyStockService. And the reason that we're doing this right in our domain layer is because this BuyStockService, it's not going to depend on Entity Framework, and it's not going to depend on the Financial Modeling Prep API. It's simply going to depend on interfaces that we have defined in our domain layer. So that means that we can just define the service in our domain layer as well. So let's go ahead and make this public, and it's going to implement our interface. And right off the bat, let's make this async because that's what we want. And this buy stock service is going to take a few things. So to buy a stock, obviously we're going to have to get the price of the stock, and to do that, we can use a IStockPriceService, which we can just call stock price service. And then if we're buying a stock, that means we're going to have to update the account of the person who is buying the stock. So we're also going to have to use an IDataService for accounts, and we'll just call this account service. And last but not least, let's pass these through the constructor, and now we're good to go. We can use these services. And quite frankly, now that we have these services, implementing this buy stock method is pretty straightforward. So of course, if we're buying a stock, first thing we're going to have to do is get the price of the stock, and we can use our wonderful stock price service for that. So we can get price, and I named this stock, but it should be symbol. That's much better. So we're getting the price of a symbol, and once we have that, we can go ahead and create a new asset transaction. We'll just call this transaction. And we can set a bunch of properties on here. So what is an asset transaction made of? Well, first we need an account, and that's going to be the person who is buying. We need an asset. So let's go ahead and create a new asset. And an asset is a class that takes a price per share. Well, that's just going to be the stock price. and then it takes a symbol, which we get from this method. And then another thing that a transaction takes is the date processed. That's simply datetime.now. We need shares. We get that through the function parameters as well. And last but not least, we need isPurchase, which is true because we are buying. And then there's also ID, which we don't set because that'll get set automatically when we insert into the database. So now that we have our transaction, we need it to be added to our buyer. So we can take our buyer's account, use this AssetTransactions property, and what we want to do is add the asset transaction to their list of asset transactions, and we can't do that because if we look at accounts, this is simply an IEnumerable, and you can't add to an IEnumerable. So what we're going to do is just make this an iCollection. And now we get the add method, so we can add the transaction. And if we're adding the transaction, another thing we're going to have to do is subtract the balance from the user's account. Otherwise, they could just buy stocks all day. So the balance, or what we're going to subtract, is the price of the stock times the amount of shares that they get. And once we have that, we are ready to update the user's account, and we can use our wonderful account service for that. So we're going to update the buyer with the new status of the buyer, and then we're simply just going to return the buyer to the caller so that they can see the new status of the buyer's account. And that's pretty much it for this buy stock implementation, except for one thing, which you guys are probably noticing, is what if the user has insufficient funds? So we need to handle that, and we're actually going to throw an exception right up here. So if the stock price times the amount of shares is greater than the account balance, not the account, the buyer's balance, then we're going to throw an exception. And we're going to create a custom exception actually. So let's go into our domain layer, our exceptions folder, and create a new item. And we're going to call this the Insufficient Funds exception. And it's going to be a public class, and it's going to inherit exception. So let's generate all these constructors, and I don't think we need the protected one. And we're going to have a couple properties up here. So we're going to have a double for the account balance of the person trying to make the transaction, and then we're going to have another property for a double that is the required balance, so how much money they actually need to complete the transaction. And we're just going to take those through the constructor. So account balance and required balance, and set these properties. All good, and then I think we need to do this for all of these constructors. And we're going to have to pass those through. And we should be good to go to use this exception. So let's go back to our BuyStockService, and we're going to throw an insufficient funds exception. And we're going to have to import that. And it takes the account balance as the first parameter. And then the required balance is going to be the stock price times shared, which we need to just move into its own variable at this point, so we don't keep having to calculate it. And we'll just call this transaction price. Move that right there. Then we can replace it everywhere. and we can use that in our exception, and we can even use it down here when we subtract from the buyer's balance. So let's go ahead and do that. And there we go. That's actually going to be everything we need for the implementation of our IBuyStockService, I believe. Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good about our IBuyStockService. Let's go ahead and test it in our app.xaml on startup. So let's create the IBuyStockService, and it's going to take a few things. So let's make sure we import all this. And let's look at this constructor. So we're also going to need a stock price service and an account service. Let's create that up here. So IStockPriceService equals a new stock price service, which is what we created in our financial modeling prep API project. So let's import all that, and we can use that down here. And then the other thing that we need is an account service, so that'll be an IDataService of accounts. Make sure we import account, and we'll call this account service equals new GenericDataService, which is what we use to talk to our database. I know we haven't used this service in quite a while, but let's import that. And then last but not least, I think this just takes the DB context factory, and then we're good to go. We can use it. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're simply going to test out this IBuyStockService. So we'll call BuyStock, and we need a buyer, so we need an account, and we're going to use our account service to get an account. And what we're going to do is just await account service dot get. So we're going to get an account by ID, and you might be thinking, well, we don't have any accounts in our database, so let's go ahead and create one. So we're going to have to open our accounts table and our users table. Let's view the data here. So first we need to create a user, because this account holder ID is a foreign key to the user. So let's create a user. So the email, we can just make all these just some dummy values. Date joined, we'll make it, I hope I format this right, just make it some random date. And that was an ID of 5, so we can use that for this foreign key right here. And the balance can be, we'll give them 500. And we actually get an ID of 3, so let's make sure we update that right here. And we're getting an issue with a wait because this is not async. So we're just going to make this async void, which is kind of weird. Usually you shouldn't really do async void, but for this situation I feel comfortable doing it. That's a whole nother story. So let's await the buy stock as well. Pass in the buyer. The symbol that we'll do is T for AT&T, I believe. And the amount of shares, we'll do 5. So now let's plop down some breakpoints in our IBuyStockService. And let's give this a shot. Okay, so we hit our first breakpoint here. And let's step over this. So we get our stock price 38.465. That sounds about right for AT&T. Calculate the transaction price. Let's look at the buyer's balance is 500, so we shouldn't hit this exception right here. And then we create our transaction, and then we can add the transaction to the buyer, and we actually get an exception. So the reason we get this exception is because, let's go to our IBuyStockService. So we got it right here, and we got it because AssetTransactions was null. And well, why is it null? Let's look at our account. It's because we never really set it to anything. But if we're grabbing the account from the database, it should set this property to at least an empty collection. So why is it not doing that? Well, it comes down to something in Entity Framework called navigation properties, okay? So let's look at our tables. And as we see, AssetTransactions are an entirely different table from accounts. So if we want to get the data in the asset transactions table for an account, we're going to have to specifically tell Entity Framework to get that data for us. And it doesn't do that automatically because to get that data, you're going to have to use a SQL join statement, and that's what Entity Framework does in the background. And join statements are not very efficient, so it just doesn't, Entity Framework's not going to force you to automatically get that data. So we're going to have to explicitly tell Entity Framework to do that for us. And that's going to create a few issues for us because we're simply using this generic data service, okay? So it's going to be kind of difficult to tell Entity Framework to include a property when we don't even know what kind of generic entity we're dealing with. So one thing that we could do is we could tell Entity Framework, okay, so we have T, just include every single possible property, do all the joins you need to do over and over again for every navigation property on whatever T is. But I actually don't want to do that because, like I said, join statements are kind of expensive, so I only want to do them explicitly. I don't want my generic data service to always include navigation properties. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a new service that is specifically for retrieving accounts. And it's going to do those includes that I was talking about on those navigation properties for us. So let's create this account data service. And it's going to be an IDataService specifically for accounts. So let's import all that, and let's actually not implement the interface. What I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to copy literally all of this. And don't worry, because we are going to refactor so that we are not duplicating code. I just want to do this real quick so I can show you guys how it's supposed to work. And one thing we're going to have to do is replace T everywhere with account real quick. And then we're also going to have to import some things. So task to list a sync that uses Entity Framework core. And then we're also going to have to import this or get this context factory from our constructor as well. So let's go ahead. Let's just copy the rest of this. Again, no worries. We're going to make this cleaner. We're not going to do any disgusting coding, except for right now, but we will refactor in this episode. Then we missed the T right here. And there we go. So we basically have the same thing. Missed the T right here. But what we need to do in these get methods and these get all methods is we need to include those navigation properties, or in other words, we need to include the asset transactions. And I actually missed more T's. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. There we go. Okay. So now, instead of using set right here, we can actually use accounts, because we know now that we're dealing with accounts. And now that we have this DB set, we can call include. And what include does is it takes a lambda right here, and you tell it what you want to include in the query. So we want to include asset transactions, and that's all we need to do. So what it's going to do is it's going to run that join statement, and it's going to return us the account that we want with the asset transactions that we need. So now that we have that, we can just copy this and do the same thing for our get all. And there we go. So now let's actually test this out real quick. So back in our app.xaml, instead of using the generic data service, we're going to use the account data service. And that's not generic. And let's go ahead back into our IBuyStockService. Okay, so we still have that breakpoint. Let's test this out this time. Okay, so right off the bat, let's check our buyer. and it has filled the asset transactions. As you can see, we have a count of 0. So now if we run through this, get our stock price, let's just go straight down here. Okay, so our asset transactions, the transaction got added, our balance got subtracted. We're going to run this update statement, and our database should be updated. Let's actually just stop right now and go check the database. And there we go, we got the new balance, and the transaction got added as well. So that is fantastic. Let's actually run again, and we'll see the transaction did get loaded in on our buyer. There we go, we have the transaction. And that's another thing. As we can see, account holder is null because account holder is an asset transaction. We're going to have to tell Entity Framework to automatically include account holder if we want it. But for now, I don't think we need it, so we're going to leave that out. If we ever need it, we can just update our AccountDataService. So again, back in our AccountDataService, I did promise that I wouldn't let us get away with having all this duplication, because the only real difference between this AccountDataService and the GenericDataService is these get methods. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder. We'll just call this common, and we'll put all of these methods, so the update, the delete, and the create methods, we'll put those into a class that can be shared between the AccountDataService and the GenericDataService, so that we're not literally just copying all this literally word for word, function for function. And we'll just call this, it's hard to come up with a name because this is kind of like, it's not really an abstraction, but we'll just call this the NonQuery data service. And by non-query, what I mean is that it basically just has data service functions except for getters. And let's go ahead and just copy all of this. I know it's weird to be copying when we're trying not to copy, but oh, actually I don't want to copy this one. I want to copy from the GenericDataService. So we're going to copy create and delete into here. And then we're also going to copy update. And then this is going to be generic. And then we're also going to have to get our context factory from a constructor. So let's go ahead and just copy a constructor in there. Make sure we change this. And if you guys don't understand what's going on right now, just hold tight because it'll all make sense when we get rid of all this duplication that we have going on real quick. So let's go ahead and import all of this. And what else do we need to import? Oh, we also have to set a constraint. So T needs to be a domain object. We went over why we need to do that when we created this GenericDataService. So let's go ahead and copy this constraint. There we go. Import domain object. And that should solve all of our issues. One more import. And there we go. So we're ready to use this non-query data service. And all it has is our create, update, and delete functions in here. And what we're going to do is we can create an instance of that non-query data service in our GenericDataService. So we'll call this the non-query data service like that. Make sure that we import it. And then we can instantiate it down here in our constructor. And it's just going to take our context factory. And now that we have this, we don't need this function at all, or all of the implementation of that function, and we can just delegate the functionality to the non-query data service. So that's exactly what we're going to do. And there we go. So it's just one line, and our non-query data service will handle the create. And why is this significant? Well, it's because we can use a non-query data service in our account data service as well. So let's import that, and then we can copy this instantiation to, and then here we go. We can delete all of that and delegate to the NonQuery data service. Just like that. So we got rid of a lot of duplication, and this actually isn't T, it's going to be account because we have an account. So we're not duplicating create functionality in these two services, and the NonQuery data service is going to handle the creates for us. And then we can also do that for our delete. So we can return await, tell our non-data query service to delete by ID. Oh, gotta call the function. And then same thing for update. Update, and it just takes the same parameters. And then we need to await that as well. And then we can go back into our generic data service and do the same exact thing. So let's paste that in. And then delete as well. Let's paste that. And we're going to delete by ID. So now these are actually a lot lighter because our non-query data service does it for us, and this just handles all the get stuff. So we're reusing a lot of code here. No more duplication, no need to worry. Everything is okay. So again, it probably would have been way easier to just edit our generic data service, edit these getAll and get methods to automatically include every single navigation property, but I simply just don't think that's the right approach because, again, joins are slow, and I don't want to automatically enforce that on every entity that uses the generic data service. So I feel like splitting these up, it took a little bit more work, but I feel like it is the correct approach. And even though we needed to create this data service, we're not duplicating logic, at least, because we delegate to this non-query data service. So one last thing I want to do is let's set this to buy 50 stocks, and let's make sure that we hit that one exception for the insufficient funds, which I expect that we probably will. And there we go, we hit the exception, so that is all working fine as well. And that's actually going to wrap it up for this episode. So we went ahead and created the IBuyStockService, which uses the stock price service and the data service for accounts. We had a little bit of an issue with the data service for accounts because Entity Framework was not, or it just simply does not automatically include navigation properties. So when we were asking for accounts from our generic data service, we weren't getting the asset transactions for the account. So what we did was we went ahead and created this account data service, and in these getters, the get and getAll methods, we're telling Entity Framework, hey, make sure you give us back those asset transactions, do that little SQL join statement in the background, and that solved our problem with the asset transactions. Now we didn't have quite enough time to create the ISellStockService, so we'll have to save that for a few episodes down the road because we did get caught up in this little navigation property issue. But that's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave that below in the comments section. But other than that, if you enjoyed the video, learned something new, be sure to leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.